Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this exciting webinar on the human rights approach to front of package warning labeling in the Caribbean. It is my pleasure to be here. My name is Carleen Radix. I am the head of health at the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, and I will be your master of ceremonies for today's proceedings. Didier Trebek, United Nations Resident Coordinator, Barbados and the OECS. Douglas Slater, Assistant Secretary General, CARICOM Directorate for Human and Social Development. Jessie Chatan, Sub-Regional Program Coordinator for the Caribbean Sub-Regional Program Coordination, Pan American Health Organization. Sir George Aline, PAHO Director Emeritus. Anand Grover, former UN Special Rapporteur on the right of everyone to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. Joy St. John, Executive Director, Caribbean Public Health Agency, all of our panelists, our partners from Healthy Caribbean Coalition and UWI, all of our guests, welcome to today's proceedings. We have an exciting agenda in store. We will start today's proceedings with welcome and opening remarks from the UN Resident Coordinator of Barbados and the OECS, from the CARICOM Secretariat, and from the PAHO Caribbean Sub-Regional Office, followed by which we will have a presentation and an understanding of the role of the UN Special Rapporteur and how special the statement by the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health on the adoption of front of package labeling is. So we'll get a better understanding of that. And then to the highlight chaired by Sir George, we'll be listening to our esteemed panelists have a conversation about front of package labeling in the Caribbean in relation to the statement of the UN. And what does it mean, including human rights obligations, our diets, and the role of evidence free from conflicts of interest in policymaking. So we have an exciting agenda in store. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Didier Trebek, the UN Resident Coordinator of Barbados and the OECS, to give some opening remarks.
Thank you, Carleen. Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Well, first I want to recognize the presence of Mr. Douglas Slater, Assistant Secretary General of CARICOM, Mr. Anand Grover, former UN Special Rapporteur, Sir George Alain, PAHO Director Emeritus, Ms. Joy St. John, Executive Director of CARFA, my colleague Jessie Chatan, PAHO Sub-Regional Program Coordinator. Well, protocol has been established. Welcome everyone from the UN, regional institutions, and colleagues and members of the media. Good morning. It's really my pleasure to welcome you all to this morning webinar, the title, The Human Rights Approach to Front of Package Warning Labeling in the Caribbean. And I must say that today's session is critical if we are to intensify the fight against non-communicable diseases. For example, statistics from CARFA indicate that NCDs are the primary cause of premature death and disability in the region, resulting in more than 75% of the total death in 2016. And additionally, 40% of NCD deaths occur prematurely in person under the age of 70. We also observe that only 8 CARICOM countries are estimated to be fairly on track towards the WHO target of 25% reduction in premature NCD mortality by 2025. And this statistic only confirms what we all know, that lifestyle and diet-related NCDs, including diabetes, cancer, cardiovascular, and chronic respiratory diseases, indeed remain a major challenge of the century. So any move to tackle these trends must be done frontally, proactively, and within a right to health approach if we are to have a fighting chance. Because the right to health is a fundamental human right recognized in international human rights law. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights is considered one of the central instruments of protection for the right to health. Ratified by most Caribbean countries, this legislation recognizes the right of everyone to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standards of physical and mental health. And health and human rights, as we're all aware, extends beyond the access to healthcare because it includes several underlying factors ranging from safe water and sanitation to adequate housing and healthy environmental conditions, amongst many others. I want also to say that in 2018, the UN General Assembly acknowledged the importance of human rights in the global response to NCDs and the important link between respecting these obligations and also scaling up these efforts. And in that connection, I want to say that the UN sub-regional team for Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean, as well as other country teams in the Caribbean region, do support all ongoing efforts by governments in the region as well as regional institutions. And we have adopted a coalition type of approach to fight this battle. It involves, of course, primarily PAHO WHO, but also UNICEF, FAO, the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, amongst many others. So as UN, we therefore pledge our full support and also urge regional governments to intensify their efforts to implement regulation of front of package warning labeling. Because these labels indicate whether the product is excessive in sugars, sodium, saturated fats, trans fat, and calories, as we know. And this information is critical to allow each and every consumer to make their own healthy and informed choices. In 2020, as you know, earlier this year, the UN launched globally the Decade of Action to accelerate the progress towards the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. And we believe that a rising incidence of NCDs has the potential to significantly derail progress, not only on the SDG 3, but on all 17 global goals. So as warned by the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health, quote, states cannot remain passive in the face of NCDs, unquote. And I want to commend CARICOM for their leadership and its affiliated institutions such as CROSC and CARFA, as the region moved towards developing a CARICOM front of package labeling standards. So in short, I would like to say that we should all unite to ensure that healthy choices become the preferred and easier option for all so that we leave no one behind. So I want to thank you all again for your participation today and wish you a very fruitful webinar. Thank you again.
Thank you, Mr. Trebek, for those insightful words. I would like to now invite Douglas Slater to give some opening remarks, Assistant Secretary General for CARICOM, Directorate for Human and Social Development. Dr. Slater.
Thank you very much, Dr. Radix, and good morning to all. I am pleased to be participating in this very important event, and I wish to bring greetings to all from our Secretary General, Ambassador Erwin Larocque, and also the rest of our staff. I wish to acknowledge the presence of our various colleagues from the UN, from our regional organizations, and our regional institutions, also many other sub-regional and colleagues and media. Special acknowledgement also to Sir George Allen, who has been working tirelessly with us on this issue. So, we know we are having this webinar in a time and an environment of COVID, an infectious disease that has taken all of the attention over the last several months, as it is common to hear that it has sucked out all the oxygen in the environment. Nonetheless, we know that NCDs, which impact our communities insidiously, has been and is expected to be the major burden of disease on our communities over the next several years. So we have to take that into consideration, that we cannot ease up the pressure in addressing manners of mitigating its impact. We from the CARICOM region, particularly, have a responsibility to ensure that the Port of Spain Declaration, which we are all familiar with, continues to guide our way forward in managing NCDs. And we have identified front of label packaging as one tool to assist in this task. I want to, before I continue, to specially recognize also our regional institution, CROSSCO. Now we know that apart from the immediate health impact, that NCDs impact significantly on the years of life and the productivity of our citizens. And this will translate into the socioeconomic development of our communities. So we know that front of label packaging, it has just been said by the previous speaker, it basically is part of a suite of measures which will provide our consumers with more information to make informed choices about their health. We have a responsibility to convince our policymakers that it is in their interest and the community's interest to facilitate with all measures in conjunction with other measures, so that the regulations and of the front of label packaging, application of front of label packaging, will have a desirable impact on the region's health and development. Consumers should be left with several tools and should have little excuse to decide on what's in their personal interests. Now, I know one of our challenges will be, how do we convince the private sector to partner with us or to take up their corporate and social responsibility in helping in this way? We know that has been a challenge for over some time, but we must continue to see how we can surmount that challenge. I know that I see this challenge as an analogy as what is happening regarding fossil fuels versus renewable energy. We know that the use of fossil fuels is damaging to the environment and has a significant impact on climate change. And there are a lot of opposition, discussions about how do you manage going forward in addressing that. I think it is one of these arguments where we have private sector stimulating economic activity with their products, but also having a negative impact on the health of citizens. We have to find that balance. And so I hope that this webinar will go a long way into addressing some of those issues. And I am optimistic that with the minds and bodies that are working on this, it has been a long task. It will continue to be a challenge, but I believe if we keep at it, we are going to make some progress or more progress. And so I look forward to a productive and successful webinar so that at the end of the day, our citizens, all our citizens will have a better health outcome, and we'll address issues such as their rights, their human rights, and hopefully that all stakeholders will understand the importance of doing so. Thank you very much. Over.
Thank you so much. Oh, I put myself off. Thank you so much for those words of optimism as we move forward. And I am happy now to invite Jessie Shutan to give some words of welcome.
Good morning, and thank you, everybody, for joining what I think is going to be, and what I hope is an inspiring and very much an exciting webinar on front-of-pack warning labels and human rights. I'm pleased to be in the presence of such long-standing and strong partners who join PAHO in standing for front-of-pack labeling. We have the CARICOM Secretariat, the United Nations Office of the Resident Coordinator and the UN system, CARFA, the O'Neill Institute, the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, the Healthy Caribbean Coalition. Thank you all for joining us on this webinar. And together, this partnership represents a strong partnership to address the multi-sectoral issue of health, childhood obesity, and with front-of-pack labeling as a tool to address childhood obesity. High blood pressure, high fasting blood sugar levels, and overweight, obesity are the top 3 risk factors for mortality in the Caribbean. How many of us listening to this webinar today have experienced or have a family member who has experienced one of these factors? High blood pressure, high fasting blood sugar levels, and overweight, obesity are responsible for the loss of healthy years of life for people in the Caribbean. If you calculate the number of years lost to people in the Caribbean due to these factors, it comes up to about 4 million years of healthy life lost in 2017 alone. And these are years of life that were lost not only because people died prematurely, but also because they live without being able to enjoy routine, everyday activities such as study, work, play, or enjoy their lives to the full potential. We're now living in the context of COVID. Persons living with NCDs face an increased risk of severe illness and death from COVID-19. In the Caribbean, about 1/3 of the population is considered to be at higher risk to severe COVID-19 based on the presence of at least one underlying health condition. The loss of lives and years of quality life lost impacts human and socioeconomic development in the region, as it reduces education attainment, labor productivity, and increases societal costs. In the Caribbean, unhealthy eating is closely linked to hypertension, diabetes, and obesity, and largely driven by the excessive intake of sugars, total fats, saturated fat, trans fat, and sodium. Some might think that the excessive intake of these critical nutrients comes from traditional home-cooked foods, but what the evidence indicates is that it's actually driven by an increased availability and consumption of processed and ultra-processed foods that are high in sugars, fats, and sodium. To date, the Caribbean population does not have access to clear information on whether a product has excess in sugar, sodium, saturated fats, trans fats, or total fats. In effect, we don't have a clear and reliable information on the ingredients and quantities of those ingredients that we're eating when we purchase foods in a can, box, or package. In the absence of clear, quick, and easy warning labels on the front of packages, people will continue to blindly buy products without knowing when they contain an excess of the nutrients. This is even more relevant during the COVID-19 pandemic, when it's crucial to help consumers at higher risk avoid products excessive and unhealthy nutrients. These unhealthy nutrients increase their chances of getting severely ill and dying from COVID-19. In an effort to change the situation, CrossQ, the CARICOM Regional Organization of Standards and Quality, is leading the revision of the current standard for prepackaged foods to incorporate front-of-pack labeling specifications. The current draft CARICOM standard includes parameters that meet the level of excellence for a standard front-of-pack label. It includes a warning system that has the best performance in meeting the purpose of identifying products that include excess sugar, fat, and sodium, and with a nutrient profile model that facilitates change in consumer decisions to meaningfully change diets. The excellence of the CARICOM draft standard is built on a robust evidence base and public health recommendations. And we hope that the Caribbean people can start benefiting from the standard region-wide. Today, we want to invite you to join a conversation about front-of-pack labeling in the context of the recent statement of the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health. Together with key Caribbean partners that are with us today, we'll discuss front-of-pack as a rights-compliant and key component of a comprehensive strategy to address overweight and obesity and explore the way forward to finalize the CARICOM draft standard and empower the Caribbean region with the tools to lead healthier lives. I look forward to the discussion and look forward to how collectively we can help to adopt front-of-pack labeling. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for those words and for all of the opening remarks. I think the stage has been set, starting with the resident coordinator speaking to the right to health, the social determinants of health and the burden of NCDs, and the fact that this needs to be a frontal fight. Dr. Slater reminding us that while the attention is on COVID, the burden remains with the NCDs, and we need to look at competing interests and find the common interests. And PAHO Sub-Regional Caribbean Office reminding us of the strong partnership we have in place, the fact that we're all affected, and the good work that CrossQ is doing to move the process forward. High sugar, high salt, high fat, we have a right to do that. So let me now introduce Oscar Cabrera, the director of the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law. I think I got that correct. Let me know if I got it incorrect. Who will introduce our next segment and take us through the next exciting piece.
Thank you very much, Carleen, and thank you to all of the previous speakers and all of the organizing partners and organizations that are putting together this. What I know it will be a very exciting and interesting event. So I'll very briefly introduce Anand Grover, who's going to be making remarks in a presentation on the context of the statement from the UN Special Rapporteur on front-of-pack labeling and human rights, and connected it to some of the work that he also did when he was UN Special Rapporteur. So Anand is currently a senior advocate practicing in the Supreme Court, and he was the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health from 2008 to 2014. He's a good colleague, friend, and human rights lawyer that has been working on the space of health law for many, many years. So now I'll give the microphone to Anand, and so he can go through his presentation. Anand, do you mind turning on your camera? and the microphone. We still cannot hear you or see your video, Anand. I don't, if you can turn it on, please.
Can you see it now?
Yes, now we can hear you and we can see your video. Perfect, Anand. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Oscar. Thank you very much, organizers. I don't have much time to thank all the organizers. May I take this opportunity to wish you that you have a very successful conference. I have a limited brief in the 8 minutes allocated to me to speak about the issue of front of package warning labeling. One of the issues is what is the role of a special procedure or rapporteur, as they're known. Special rapporteurs are appointed through various procedures in the UN. Ultimately, they are the rapporteurs for the UN, and they have various tasks. One is to actually monitor, advise, and report on human rights problems on the mandate they have. For example, the rapporteur on health will look at the health mandate and monitor, advise, and report on human rights issues and problems. The second thing is the rapporteur would attend to individual complaints which come from various states and then inform the states and actually see to it that the states are accountable. Thirdly, the rapporteurs also make thematic reports on areas of concern. So I made a report on unhealthy food and the right to health, abortion, access to medicines, etc. And for that, studies are conducted with participation of states as well as non-governmental, non-state actors. And finally, they also undertake, depending on the state's invitation, fact-finding country missions to various countries and then report on all these issues to either the UN General Assembly, or if it's a country mission, they would do it to the Human Rights Council. Now, this has been happening for a very long period of time. The present rapporteur who's made the statement is the 4th special rapporteur. So already we are in for about 20 years now. And there's a wealth of information which is available from the rapporteur's reports and missions, which inform the human rights situation on every issue. The present rapporteur, she has in fact made a statement on unhealthy foods. Basically, she has actually mentioned that there's a huge burden of NCDs, which the other speakers have also highlighted. As a result, there is overweight, obesity, and especially on children. The duties of the states are to regulate these activities and make sure that the food and beverage industry, which are increasingly impacting and in fact contributing to the global obesity, and now it's an epidemic of NCDs, that they mitigate the detrimental impact on the right to health. And therefore, the duties of the states are to strengthen legal frameworks and safeguard the policies that protect the right to health. In this context, though Article 12 of the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights states what the right to health is, it has been elaborated in what is known as General Comment 14. And there it has been stated that the right to health is to have health goods, facilities, and services being available, accessible, acceptable, and good quality. And the obligation on the states is to respect, that is, they should not themselves interfere with the right to health and protect, which is very key in this right of front of package labeling, protect the right to health from interference by non-state actors, namely the private corporations, and fulfill the right to health by introducing regulations and mechanisms where, in this case, information would be available to citizens. And basically, in this case, everybody's ad item on the issue that front of package labeling is very important, but the food and beverage industry is not very keen to get them on board. The earlier speaker did mention that we have to partner with the industry, and I think we can convince them if we are able to get them on board and say in the long run, it is also in the interest of industry, even for their profit making, to have healthy foods. This is a short-term measure for them to make profits by selling ultra-processed and unhealthy foods. In the long run, if we have healthy foods, we have healthy people, there'll be more of us and there'll be more consumption. So I don't think they need to worry over a long period of time. But the consumers also have a right to have healthy and informed choices, identify nutrient profile and which are detrimental to health. And therefore, the adoption of front of package labeling is the key. And in this area and in this region, everybody knows that this is happening all over the world, but the increase in ultra processed foods have grown tremendously over the past decade or so, more than 25%, and then food consumption has gone over and increased by 40%. Children have become obese. Their obesity is increasing. It has tripled from 1990 to 2016. There are inadequate diets which are associated with more deaths than any other risk factor. Thousands of people are dying in this region, Latin America and the Caribbean. So we need to take action. When I was a special rapporteur, I also looked into this in my report, which was put forward to the and presented to the UN General Assembly on 1st April of 2014. And basically, I also said, like the present special rapporteur, that the direct investment in terms of foreign direct investment in the food sector is huge and pervasive. And there is marketing of unhealthy foods, which has increased the consumption of unhealthy foods, fats, trans fats, sugars, and sodiums, which are directly linked to the NCDs. Citizens have the right to the availability and accessibility of healthier food options, which is part of the right to health, and also have the right to access to information and awareness about health risks presented by unhealthy foods. States have the obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill, as I mentioned, what they are, the right to health. And there have to be various accountability and remedial mechanisms for individuals to redress the violation of the right to health. States have to regulate the food industry to take concrete steps to reduce production and consumption of unhealthy foods and increase the availability and affordability of healthier food options. Now today, if I want to buy organic food, is much more expensive. How do we make sure that there are more of them so they are competitive and the prices come down? So again, even in 2014, like the present rapporteur, my recommendation was to adopt internationally acceptable nutritional labeling guidelines and to comply with the domestically enacted guidelines in this respect. So there are cases and examples of what type of front of package labeling you can have. So there's the endorsement system, logos and seals to food products, summary systems which give an overall guideline summary score, monochromatic guidelines for daily amounts of food, which apply a miniature reproduction of the nutritional facts panel on the FOPL, color-coded GDA reference system. These use different coloring system corresponding to the traffic light signs and depending on the level of nutrient content. Then nutrient-specific textual and color-coded systems, also known as a traffic light system, which use multiple textual information associated with color codes to indicate the level of concentration of specific nutrients, and the high accessive system and use of FOP text-based seals to inform consumers when products contain excessive amounts of critical nutrients. So they have excess denoted by X, then if it's medium, etc., and low on the critical food nutrients which are unhealthy, like fat, sodium, trans fats, etc. So what is the evidence? The evidence is quite clear, because even under the right to health, we have to proceed on the basis of scientific evidence. It is clear that FOPLs is the easiest existing labeling to understand, the clear way to identify unhealthy products. There is evidence in studies that efficacy of warning exists in public health literature. It actually contributes to greater knowledge, increased risk perception of health harms, reduced consumption of these products, and informed decision making. Warning highlights only those products with high content of key nutrients which are deleterious to health. The traffic light system classifies contents of each nutrient. This is very popular, but which is actually effective? You'll have to study that. But we have some studies which indicate that. So warnings are superior guidelines in the daily amount of GDA and traffic light systems, because the ability to improve consumer capacity to find nutritional information, to highlight perception of products with high energy, fats, sugar, and sodium content, discourage children's choices of labels and snack products, decrease the consumption of unhealthy products, and modify the obesogenic environments which have been defined by the World Health Organization as those environments that provide high energy intake and sedentary behavior. So I think the stage is set for you to take a call on how we can actually make sure that front of package labeling can in fact be introduced in the Caribbean region. There's a wealth of information available. We can't be prescriptive and tell you what you should do. That is your own remit, but there is a wealth of literature which informs what are the ways and what are better ways in some countries. So I'll stop here and thank you very much. And I'm open to answering any question that you may have. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Anand. If you don't mind, just stop sharing your screen so we can see that. Perfect. So we have one question that I think it could kind of help kind of connect with some of the issues you were talking about. And basically the question is, it goes to specifically countering industry interference. So how can governments, and I would add probably civil society as well, but how can this statement and those standards from the UN Special Rapporteur could be used to try to counter corporations' interference in this type of policy making? And in addition to labeling, whether there are other specific measures that should be adopted to tackle diet-related NCDs. Anna,
is that a question to me?
Yes, that's a question to you.
Well, one of the earlier speakers, eminent speakers, did raise this question. I think it is important to have the industry on board. And there has been a change over a period of time in different countries. And I think industry as a whole knows that actually this is in the interest of societies as a whole, for the population as a whole. So they also have a moral and ethical responsibility. But under the right to health and the human rights instruments, we know that industry now has the obligation to protect the right to health and protect human rights. So they are not free from obligations, though they are not technically obliged in law internationally, but on the basis of the obligation to protect by the states, and there also the obligation to protect interference from human rights. I think we can persuade the corporations in terms of law and persuade them also in terms of economic interest of theirs. I think in the long run, they know that it is in their interest to have healthy food, which will actually improve the health status of all people within a particular state. This is only a short-term measure for them to make money, but in the long run, those who actually orient towards healthier food, they will find that consumers actually veer towards them. And that's been the experience over a period of time. I think that should be what should be sold to corporations. But it'll take time. And depending on how states are actually strong enough to take up corporations and influence them and persuade them, it'll depend on that kind of thing.
Great. Thank you very much, Anand. I think we had another quick question, but I don't know, I'm looking at the rest of the panelists and our master of ceremony to see if we have time for one more question. Carlene? One. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So Anand, this is one that I think you kind of alluded at the beginning of your presentation, but basically, where does the obligation or duty of states to protect health come from? So what are some of those instruments and texts where this is kind of derives from?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the right to health is incorporated in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And there is what is known as a general comment for most of these rights. And General Comment 14 elaborates the right. Once a state has actually ratified the International Covenant, there's an obligation for them to comply with it. Now, the obligation is different depending on most of the countries in the Caribbean are common law systems, but there are also civil law systems. Civil law systems would actually incorporate the international treaty directly, and there'll be applicable law. In the common law system, they may have to actually enact a law to implement that particular the covenant. But the right to health has been elaborated as far as the obligation of the states are concerned. The obligation is to respect the right to health. That is, the state itself should not interfere, should not introduce laws to encourage, for example, unhealthy food. So that will be direct interference by the state. To protect the right from interference by third-party non-state actors and fulfill it by, for example, introduce front of package labeling. So that is the obligation of the state in very simple terms. Thank you.
No, great. Thank you very much, Anna. And I know that you won't be able to stay with us for the rest of the panel. I know it's very late in India already. So thank you very much for joining us. I really enjoyed your presentation. So thank you, Anna, for your time and your presentation. Over to you, Caroline.
Thank you very much, Oscar and Anand. This was a really informative segment for me. Now I know exactly where to quote in terms of the right to health and the obligation of the states in this endeavor. And certainly within the Caribbean region, we have taken that obligation seriously with regards to the work being done by CrossQ. Let me just recognize that the director of CrossQ is on with us, as well as the president of the Healthy Caribbean Coalition. So I just wanted to recognize their presence in our midst. I'm now going to hand over to Sir George Aline, Director Emeritus of PAHO and NCD champion, who is going to take us through the next section of this process with our esteemed panelists. So George.
Thank you very much, Carlene. Thank you very much indeed. I trust you can hear me. Yes, good. Thank you very much indeed, Carlene. Thank you very much. No, we have heard a very elegant presentation by the former Special Rapporteur and the very, very concrete and concise answers he's given. I'd like to begin this section by establishing what for me are four absolute impenetrable facts, things that are impatient of debate. I'd like to state first that food intake, we've heard, from all we've heard, food intake is a major determinant of the continuing rise of non-communicable diseases in the Caribbean. That's one. The second fact is that front of package warning labels represent a key measure to affect that intake and the impact on NCDs, number two. Number three is that as an aspect of their human rights and their right to health, then the Caribbean people have a right, an absolute right to have access to this information about their food and and that information can be conveyed by front of package warning labels. And the fourth thing that comes through is that the presence of COVID places an imperative on the Caribbean and the world as a whole to look at this aspect of the control of the non-communicable diseases. And it's against that background that we are having now a conversation about the aspects of food front of package warning labels as it relates to the Caribbean and the possibility of the Caribbean institutions lending their collective voice in moving this process forward. We have a very interesting panel and a panel with us. We have, I see Douglas Slater on the video. I don't see myself. I think perhaps my video is on, but I don't see it, but never mind. But can you hear me?
We're hearing you very well.
Oh, good.
We are hearing and we are seeing you, Sir George.
Sorry?
We are hearing and also seeing you.
Oh, excellent. Thank you very much. We have as a panel, Alejandro Mocheletti, who is the legal advisor for Human Rights, Office of Legal Counsel in PAHO. I'm going to introduce all of the panel at one go rather than do it individually. We have Nicole Foster, who is the Deputy Dean for Academic and Student Affairs in the Faculty of Law at UW and Cape Hill. We have David Hammond, a professor and the chair in Applied Public Health School of Public Health and Health Systems, University of Waterloo in Canada. And also Maisha Hutton, the Executive Director of the Healthy Caribbean Coalition. Oscar Cabrera, who is the Director of the prestigious O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law. And also Dr. Joyce St. John, who is the Executive Director of the CARPHA, the Caribbean Public Health Agency. So without further ado, I'm going to lead off with Alejandro. Alejandro, as we start this statement, can you tell us a little more, dive into a little more about the right to health framework and what are the obligations it imposes on states? And perhaps expand a bit quickly on what we heard from Anand.
Thank you.
Alejandro.
Yes, thank you, Sir George. Definitely, as Anand explained really well, what implies the right to health and the ratification of treaties. Let me give you, I mean, he explained about the Convention of the Economic and Social and Cultural Rights and General Comment number 14 of the committee. Let me give you an example also with another treaty, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, that has been widely ratified in all the Caribbean states. If you look at Article 24, it states, similarly to the Convention of Social, Economic and Cultural Rights, that everybody has a right to highest and attainable standard of health. But Article 24 also established that children and parents should have access to information in relation to nutritious foods, and the right also to nutrition and healthy foods. Then what that does imply for the countries, the states that have ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child? As Anand mentioned before, when a state ratifies a treaty, it has a duty to respect, protect, and fulfill. And protect is to protect the rights of the people from the interference from third parties. And which is, when we talk about third parties, we are talking about privates, we are talking about companies, business activities. And if you combine the right to protect and the obligation to protect and the obligation to fulfill, that means that you need to take measures, appropriate measures, including legislation, including other measures, in order to prevent violations by business activities. And as Anand put it very clearly, that means labeling, that means access to information, that means the right to choice, the right of having an informed consent when you make a decision, when you make an option of the kind of food that will intake for you and for your children when we are talking about the Convention of the Rights of the Child. I mean, and we can go over the different conventions of human rights, but clearly the Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights and the Convention of the Rights of the Child, that I repeat, has been widely ratified, not only as a human rights treaty, but many states has also child protection legislation or different kind of legislation that includes the best interest of the child. In combination with Article 24 and the right to health, clearly states this obligation and duty to protect from the interference of other parties.
Thank you very much. Very elegantly put. Nicole, we've heard the global picture. What I would ask you to do for us is to outline the implications for this right to health framework in the Caribbean, particularly as it relates to the Caribbean process of moving this FOPL standard forward.
Thanks, Sir George. So just following on from what Alejandro would have just discussed. So the idea is that we in the Caribbean, both at the level of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, as well as on the rights to the child, are signatory are member states of these agreements, and therefore those obligations have implications for us in terms of how our government should operate. And so just to remind persons that the rights of the child have been ratified by every single CARICOM member. Every single CARICOM member has ratified that and therefore has binding legal obligations at the international level in terms of the right to protect, in particular, here when we're talking about FOPL, but also too in terms of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. I was just checking quickly before we started. And in fact, the only member states in CARICOM who have not ratified that are St. Kitts and Nevis and St. Lucia. Everybody else has ratified it. So whether we're talking about specifically children, who of course are a special group and a vulnerable group, and we have, in a sense, almost extra special obligations in that regard, but even just at the level of human beings in the context of the international covenant, our governments have obligations, certainly the majority of them do. And so what does that mean for us at the regional level? Certainly in the context of the regional process on FOPL is taking place. Primarily those consultations and discussions are taking place within the confines of COSCU at the CARICOM level. And certainly COSCU has a defined and an established way of operating, and we wouldn't expect that that would change. But certainly what I would like to think is that in the context of this very strong and important statement from the Special Rapporteur, that we would see within the CARICOM bodies generally, including COSCU, a greater appreciation and understanding of the need to integrate human rights into our thinking and into how we operate. And the point that I believe it was Jesse made earlier up, these standards are based on evidence. And certainly COSCU is a body that is very much about the science and the evidence. And so I think it's important for us to recognize it is not just about health advocates just wanting best endeavor or, the ideal world that they've dreamed up just on what they think works. This is what has been tried and tested and analyzed. And so I think there is a role for the CARICOM institutions more broadly to take account of this, particularly bearing in mind the obligations of the member states. I think also, and I'll close with this, that it also, the statement from the Special Rapporteur also opens an important opportunity for civil society. So within the Caribbean, we have not traditionally had deep engagement by civil society on these issues. And I think the Special Rapporteur's statement highlights again the importance of the civil society role in terms of holding governments to account. And
okay.
I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Nicole. We get onto the issue of civil society later, as I'm sure that Maisha will expand on that. And David, we heard Anand speak of the various kinds of labels we might have. You've had tremendous experience in the different kinds of labels. Would you walk us through your ideas, your experience, and which might be the best for the Caribbean?
Thank you very much, Sir George. That's right. And I've been conducting research on warnings and product labeling for over 20 years. I served as an advisor for the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control to the World Health Organization. And I've also testified in legal challenges to warnings, and I bring that to this talk. I'm going to cut right to the chase. We sometimes talk as if we're forging new ground. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of studies that have established the basic scientific principles of product labeling and warnings. And one of the most basic concepts is that labels should feature images that are simple and intuitive. This ensures that they're noticed and they're understood at a glance. And that's true whether we're talking about traffic signs, warnings for occupational hazards in the workplace, or FOP nutrition labels. In fact, it's especially true for FOPs, which are relatively small, and they must communicate simple and interpretive messages in a very brief amount of time. Now, as you already heard Anand discussed, and as most of you are aware, there are different symbols being used in different countries, including symbols that are based on traffic lights or different types of rating systems. Now, there's evidence that most of these can be effective in certain contexts, but I'd like to point out two clear findings from the scientific evidence. And the first one is that FOP systems that focus primarily on nutrient numbers are the least effective. We already have the labels on the back or the side of package for that. This type of FOP fails both the principles of being simple and intuitive, and most importantly, it fails with regards to equity and impact among lower socioeconomic consumers. The second finding that I'd like to highlight is that Octagon FOPs are the most effective for informing consumers and for helping them to reduce the intake of foods of nutrients of concern, salt, sugar, etc. And that's largely because the Octagon uses a well-established symbol of a stop sign, which is universally recognizable regardless of language, culture, or literacy level. Now, I've specifically been asked to talk about what some people refer to as the Canadian magnifying glass. Now, first, I'd like to clarify that Canada has not selected the magnifying glass as the symbol for its FOP standard. In fact, nothing's been selected to date. They're still in that process. Rather, the magnifying glass was a suggestion from industry and was included in a consultation that Health Canada has conducted. Now, what do we know about the magnifying glass? Well, we've conducted an experiment after it was proposed by the industry in Canada, and we wanted to see how well it helped consumers to identify foods high in sugar and saturated fat. We've published this. What did we find? What we found is that the magnifying glass performed the worst of all the warnings we tested. Consumers were least likely to be able to correctly identify which foods were high in sugar and saturated fat. What about the Octagon labels in the same study? They were significantly more effective than the magnifying glass. And at the end of this experiment, we asked the consumers in our study, which of these is the best symbols for helping you identify a product that's high in certain nutrients of concern? And this is what we found. The magnifying glass performed the worst of all the different versions that were under consideration by Health Canada, and the Octagons were rated as the most effective. Now, one of the things that's happened in Canada is that the industry has argued that Octagons should not be implemented, mainly because consumers would find them too harsh. Well, we empirically tested this claim in a different published study, and we put the question directly to consumers. And in fact, we found very high levels of support for the Octagons. 90% of Canadians said the Octagon was either the right strength or it should be even stronger. And we've replicated this finding in 6 different countries. In short, there is no evidence to the claim that consumers don't like this or find it too harsh. The opposite is the case. And I know that one of the themes today is human rights, and especially addressing inequities in diet nutrition. And to that end, it's important to point out that Octagon FOPs not only have the strongest empirical support, they've also been shown to reduce disparities among consumers from lower socioeconomic groups. That's among the highest priorities for nutrition labeling policies, and the Octagons check that box. Now, overall, I have no doubt concluding that there is little or no scientific basis for selecting a magnifying glass symbol for FOPs. While there are dozens of studies on Octagons and their impact on consumer behavior, including real naturalistic studies in countries like Chile, there's almost no published literature on the magnifying glass other than what I shared today, which shows that it's less effective. And I'd like to make one last final point. This is potentially important if the industry issues a legal challenge to FOP regulations. They have threatened to do this in Canada and other countries. And I can tell you, as someone who's testified as an expert witness in cases around the world, that it would be very hard for a government to defend choosing the magnifying glass over an Octagon based on any scientific evidence. So that's all from me today. Thanks for your time, and I'd be pleased to answer any questions now or at the end of the session.
Thank you very much, David. To the extent that the Caribbean people are not different from Canadians, I think I'm convinced that with your presentation, your lucid arguments, that Octagon remains by far the best state one for the Caribbean people to adopt. Thank you very much for that very lucid presentation. Maisha, Nicole mentioned earlier on the role of civil society. What has been your experience in the terms of the role of civil society as it relates to industry interference and as it relates to the interference in the regional process? What has been your experience and what would you advise?
Thanks, Sir George, for this important question. The HCC and civil society actors have been advocating for FOPL throughout the entire duration of this process. And without question, our greatest challenge has been interference from the private sector. So we were very pleased and encouraged to see this statement from the Special Rapporteur, which explicitly calls for member states to exercise their obligation to decisively counter undue influence of corporations and safeguard the policies that protect the right to health from commercial and other vested interests of the food and beverage industry. So what have been the key challenges that we have faced as civil society? The food and beverage sector in the Caribbean, supported by the wider private sector, is extremely well coordinated, well mobilized, well resourced, and they have strong political influence and lobbying power. In fact, very recently, the CARICOM private sector organization was just recognized by heads as an associate institution of the community. And so this strong connection between the industry and policymaking has created a situation in which most of the interference is behind the scenes and makes it very challenging for us as advocates to expose and to counter. The private sector has also very effectively exploited these national FOPL standards consultative processes, which are occurring at country level. They have some inherent weaknesses in their transparency and accountability mechanisms. And as a result, we've seen at times an almost brazen exploitation of the consultative process. And what do I mean by this? We've seen a clear power imbalance and power dominance at the level of the private sector. On these committees, there are various categories of voting. And for example, private sector has one category and one vote. But often we see that if there are, let's say, X number of private sector representatives on the committees, instead of getting one vote, they're getting multiple votes. And it's disproportionately skewing the position of the countries. They've also been clogging up the process by repeatedly submitting scientifically baseless evidence. And they do this over and over again, despite the fact that the issues have been put to bed. So the issues are raised repeatedly, and we almost feel like we're on a treadmill, so to speak, which is being controlled by the private sector. This is further complicated by a lack of documented guidance around the process, which allows us as advocates to hold the process to account. So some of the strategies that we've been employing to counter and build support are, we've showed up, we've tried to show up ensuring that we're well informed about the process. We have arguments to counter industry. That piece about being informed about the process is really important so that we can identify when we don't have one group, one vote, when we are repeatedly reviewing content so that we can ensure that the process retains its integrity. And we're also trying to build public and policymaker support through the level of sending letters behind the scenes and open letters. We have digital campaigns around this fundamental right to know, trying to build consumers' awareness around that. And we've recently released an op-ed on putting public health before industry profits. And I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Mansh, I'm going to come back to you again and ask you about the other channels of influencing policymakers. If one other channel is the media and involvement of the media, I'm going to come back to that again. Oscar, can you tell us again more about the interference tactics used by the industry? How would you characterize these interference tactics and their importance in terms of basing decision-making and policies on the scientific evidence and which the statement contains should be free of conflict of interest? Oscar.
Thank you very much for the question. And I'll connect with just two basic points that we have been discussing throughout this webinar and this event. One is a very clear obligation on the part of the states to prioritize the protection of the public health and to regulate private actors, in this case, corporations, so they don't affect negatively the population health, right? So I think in that context, that obligation to protect is very clear. What we see in a lot of countries, this happens in the Caribbean, happens all over the world, is that corporations have a very strong way of oftentimes even capturing government. really having an influence on government decision making, on processes, that makes almost impossible the ability of governments to advance with policy, good policies that at some point need to regulate this private actors. So what they do has been discussed. They try to discredit evidence. They try to attack the validity and the efficacy of these measures. Once they're provided with the evidence, then they go into legal challenges. So they try to challenge the legal authority of governments to enact this type of measures. Then very quickly, they start making arguments around trade and the impact that this type of measures will have on trade agreements, on economic development. And once all of the data and arguments and very objective evidence is presented that disproves all of this lines of reasonings, they go on to challenge in court, right? So they use the legal system to challenge this type of measures. And what they're seeking here is delayed implementation, attacking the validity of this type of measure. So I think it's part of this government obligation to clearly regulate, clearly put a spotlight when this type of practices for the industry are having a detrimental impact to the possibility of advancing with good policies. And in this context, I would just highlight 2 points that are made in the statement: issues around transparency, around making sure that that the evidence, that the policies are based on scientific evidence, free from conflict of interest. And that, I think, it's key, right? We need to use the evidence to inform our policies that is not, that doesn't have any conflict of interest. So I'll stop there, Sir George, so we can kind of continue with the conversation, but maybe I'll add something later on.
Thank you very much, Austin. That was very clear. Dr. St. John, can you tell us more about the 6-point policy package on reduction of obesity and other CARICOM initiatives, other CARICOM mandates, which would support the adoption of the front of package warning labeling? Dr. St. John.
With great pleasure, Sir George. So you may have heard of 6PPP, those of you in the audience, but the full name is the CARFA Plan of Action for Promoting Healthy Weights in the Caribbean, Prevention and Control of Childhood Obesity, which got the policy approval at the regional level in 2015 by the CARICOM Council on Human and Social Development, and also by the CARICOM Council on Trade and Economic Development. And what it is a suite of measures, 6 points. And I'll just give you the 6 points quickly. Food labeling, nutrition standards and guidelines for schools and other institutions. Number 3, reduce children's overall exposure to unhealthy food advertising through all channels. 4, nutritional quality of food supply, the levels of harmful ingredients. 5, trade and fiscal policies. And 6, food chain incentives. Let me go back up to number 1 because it has the greatest relevance to our discussion today. And it is not just the front of package labeling, which we've been discussing, but also mandatory uniform nutrition facts panels, regional guideline for standardized interpretive nutrition labels, regulate nutrient content, nutrient function, health claims, and on-pack marketing, and guidelines for mandatory nutrition labeling on menus and menu boards. So the 6-point policy package really gives a suite of measures to assist governments in providing that enabling environment that they have the obligations to. So the cross-cue measures were all under the unpacking of these 6 points. So we would have CARFA would have brought many CARICOM institutions together to see how they could implement those 6 policy points. And cross-cue has lived up to its promise to work on the front of package labeling. So apart from that, CARFA has also had policy initiative with government, health, agriculture, and education, and we brought in trade. Going back to the CARICOM level, other initiatives, there was the joint COSOD, COTED meeting, which was a culmination of a process where we would have brought together the public health agencies, both at the regional and sub-regional level, CARFA, the NGOs, and also industry, on talking about ways that we can work jointly to ensure that there is the right provision and support of healthy choices, and also that the industry can learn how to make the healthier food the right choice. So the Caribbean has been busy, and bringing us back to what times we're in, COVID-19 times. The effects of NCDs on severe and critical disease, the fact that we've seen younger persons with NCDs having severe illness and dying, makes it an imperative to take back up this mantle and work towards the fight towards NCDs.
Thank you very much, Dr. John. There are 2 points you raised, which I'd like to highlight. One is your point at the end of the importance of COVID, making it even more imperative for us to address this issue. And second, the point that you made of CARFA working with the agencies, and I like how you mentioned specifically CROSSQ, lending technical support to CROSSQ to facilitate its moving the process forward. So thank you all very much indeed. One question that has been raised throughout your presentations, everyone implicitly accepts that the right to health is an important approach. We are all convinced of the other approaches. Is there any possibility of having a collective Caribbean, at the level of policymakers, a collective appreciation that this right to health is another important reason for moving the process forward? Let me begin with the last person, Dr. St. John.
Well, I think that how the heads of government, the ministers of health, and the chief medical officers have come together collectively to work on COVID-19 shows that the appetite for collective action, the fora, the media for collective action, even in a virtual life that we're living now, that is very possible. So if it was very possible for COVID-19, it's very possible for NCDs and front of package labeling.
Okay, thank you very much. If I may put the same question to Maisha, the possibility of this collective approach, especially to the issue of human rights, because we agree that these other arguments have relevance. But here today, we are focused on the possibility that this approach, human rights approach, might be the one that might stimulate even more collective action. Aisha, how would you address this? What would you think about this? And what would you think about the role of the media in facilitating the action, agility on the part of the policymakers and adopting this rights approach in looking at front of package warning labeling?
Thanks, Sir George. I think it's an important message, and it's an important step for policymakers to make. It's something that we've certainly, from the perspective of civil society, been advocating for, a united kind of front from the political leadership in the Caribbean around this right to health, specifically as it relates to NCDs. I think the media has the potential to play a significant role. And certainly this is something that we have been working on very concertedly with our partners in, for example, the Heart and Stroke Foundation of Barbados, the Heart Foundation of Jamaica, trying to use the media as the engine to deliver this message. There are many competing priorities at the moment, competing issues, namely COVID, but it's certainly something that we have been working on, and I think it's probably going to be one of the most effective tools in our toolbox to build public support, to put pressure on policymakers.
Okay, thank you very much. Nicole, would you have a take on that, the possibility of this collectivity, Caribbean collectivity? Dr. St. John was optimistic that having worked together effectively in one area, it is possible to work effectively to promote this rights to health at a collective level in the Caribbean. Nicole, what would your take on this?
Yeah, so I agree that certainly the collective approach is the approach that we have to take because of the nature of the challenge of NCDs. And certainly in a region such as ours, we would want to have a common voice, a common approach to tackling this problem, because this is not a problem unique to any one CARICOM state. And I equally agree with yourself and Maisha that human rights, I think, is an important tool, sort of something new in the toolbox to sort of engage our policymakers. But I think at the same time, looking from the outside, so I'm not part of the government structure, so looking from the outside, I think we really have to focus on the influence of industry in terms of creating the necessary political will to act, because for the collectivity to work, there must be that political will to take the hard decisions. And I think industry interference is a key element that we have to make sure we address if we are to be able to move ahead in terms of collective work.
Thanks very much. David, if I were to ask you for your advice as to how to make this human rights approach an additive to the scientific evidence which you have demonstrated so clearly that the Octagon approach is the best approach. David?
Hi, sorry. I think you've heard others say it already, which is to say that any measure that's implemented needs to be effective, not just in general, but effective among those that need it most, which is the lower socioeconomic folks, folks that speak different languages. And it should rely upon a symbol that is easily and universally recognized. Now, something like the Octagon, which is based on the stop sign, is something that even children recognize. It requires no other education. That is not true with the magnifying glass.
Okay, let me put it this way. If we are going to use a rights to health approach, is there anything about the octagonal approach that lends itself easily to this rights to health patina?
Well, I just think it will be, as I said, it has to be most effective among those most in need. And we have evidence showing that the Octagon does very well across all groups, across different countries with different cultural contexts. That's not true for the others. Okay. And so I think it's almost that simple, but yes, there is scientific evidence.
Okay. Alejandro, do you have anything to add to this debate to date? Alejandro.
Yes. No, just to say that we also have to think about human rights, not only from the perspective of duties and obligation, what it is, but also as a guidance, an opportunity to have this, you were talking about collecting actions and and grouping together the countries. This guidance with the evidence, as just David explained, also is a guidance on how to go forward and how to move progressively to adopt the measures needed to comply with the right. It's a duty, it's an obligation, but it's also a mandatory guidance that helps the country to adopt something unanimously in the region. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And Oscar, what do you think?
No, I agree with what Alejandro just said. And one thing that I always like to stress is that we try to structure the conversation around whether countries can do this. Are governments allowed to do this type of labeling? Are governments allowed to restrict marketing of unhealthy commodities? Which is a perfectly valid question. But the first question should be, inaction on the part of governments will also affect this type of international human rights obligation. So inaction in this context, when we have a clear evidence on the impact that these unhealthy products have on the health of the population, on the effectiveness of this type of measures, like inaction is not an option. And just to kind of quick comment to connect with what Alejandro said, I think on human rights, we focus on the content, the nature of the obligation, which is a key part, but also on the process. I think making this a human rights-based process, that it's open, transparent, that is not something that is decided behind closed doors without participation from civil society. I think all of those issues are key to ensure that this is an effective policy that complies with human rights obligations.
Thank you very much. Elisa, we have a couple of questions, I think.
Yes, thank you, Sir George. So we have a number of questions. I think a majority of them have been addressed somehow by this second round of the panel, but I would like to share a couple of additional questions that may be of interest. The first one is, frontal package labeling will cause a reduction in access to food, especially where there are breaks in supply chains with COVID-19 due to increased prices. Is this a valid argument? Do you wish me to read the others?
I mean, is it a valid argument that because there's increase in prices, it is not appropriate to move forward this approach? Is that the burden of the question?
Correct. The burden of the question is, will frontal
before you go on, let us deal with that one. I think that one is fairly easy. Let me start again as I finished last time. Dr. St. John, would you buy that argument?
Not at all.
Agreed.
I think people see a divide, and perhaps there is a divide now, but we can find ways to help the industry reformulate. We can find ways to help the industry maximize profits and make sure that persons aren't unhealthy. The burden of NCDs is not going anywhere soon. So we have to change the paradigm. We have to find different ways to address it.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a question here about, is there a mechanism to track CARICOM's implementation of the policy commitments? If in fact CARICOM did, as a group, did accept this human rights approach, how can we know that they have done it? Nicole, what would you say to that?
So what I would say is that is the main point, the main challenge that we have. Certainly the issue of the accountability of CARICOM, non-implementation of obligations continues to be an ongoing issue. The CARICOM process is a state-based process, so it's not really a process that has integrated into it fully sort of separate accountability strand, but there is some engagement by civil society, and that's why I said that there is a role for civil society to play in terms of, you know, trying to hold governments to account. The main challenge that you have is information. The information is not often easily accessible.
Okay. Okay, thanks very much. Before we close, because we have a hard stop in a couple of minutes, I'm going to ask Dr. Slater if he would like to comment briefly on that, because a very relevant point. If in fact that the CARICOM governments collectively do agree that there is a human rights dimension to this and accept their responsibility in that context, is there a way of tracking this? Dr. Slater, you wanted to make a brief comment on that?
Thank you, Sir George. I've been listening with intent attention because these are some of the challenges of regional integration. And we have seen experiences where decisions are made by our policymakers. The problem is the challenge, and it was alluded to earlier, of implementation. And again, as was stated earlier, because this is the implementation is a responsibility at individual member states level at the end of the day, instead of, it's not easy to always get a common regional response. It is going to be a challenge, but we have to find ways of, for the want of a better, we're putting some pressure on the member states, the policymakers, to adhere to their responsibilities of human rights, etc. And that's a role that I think the civil society has a very important role to play in that. But we will do our best from our level to remind the policymakers, to encourage them to so do. Thank you.
This is a very interesting one. And I take away from your comment, Dr. Slater, that yes, at the regional level, there does exist a mechanism for tracking whether these commitments have been taken up or not. One of the questions that comes up often is a trade implication. And the question is there research to determine the possible trade implications with relation to the region major trading partners? And as far as different front of package labeling is concerned, than what is currently for consideration across Q. Who would like to address this? Is there research to determine the possible trade implications with the region's major trading partners that would affect our adoption of the food of package warning labels? Nicole, do you have any take on this, the trade implications?
So quickly, Sir George, so we don't have, to the best of my knowledge, specific evidence. I believe Jamaica was doing some, but those findings are not out yet. But I think you made the point earlier. Children in Barbados are no different to children in Canada, or Chile, or Mexico, or Ecuador, or all of these places that are also moving towards implementing front-of-pack labeling. And the validity of the scientific findings that have been arrived at are applicable. Now, will there be trade implications? Undoubtedly, but we have to recognize that this question, we're not making a decision about what is the least trade impact measure. We're having a discussion about what is the measure that will be most effective in terms of addressing our NCD burden. Then we can deal with how do we manage the fallout that comes from that. But I think the question, in a way, has the issue flipped. The issue is not one of trade, the issue is one of health. And then we try to manage what happens in the context of the health, whether it be through reformulation, marketing of healthier products, maybe subsidies to help with healthier products and local agriculture, etc.
Okay, so you've done, I like your dissection of the issue. I like your dissection, dividing the issue into the various component parts that might be addressed separately. I'm going to try, I won't try to summarize, but I'm going to leave a couple of minutes for Dr. Radix to make the closing comment. But I like to—
Sir George,
yes?
this is Oscar. I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to add that one small comment on the trade argument.
Please do.
This is something we see in every country, in every region, and it's usually kind of a challenge to intimidate governments from moving forward with this type of policies. I think the research has been done, the legal analysis has been done in multiple countries, multiple regions. It could be done to adapt to the specificity of the Caribbean region, but this type of measures do not impose a barrier to trade that affects any type of trade agreements. So, and I want to highlight that because it's usually something that an even offer from Georgetown, from the law school, and some of the partnership we have with other universities in the Caribbean. If there needs to be more research or applied research to the context, we're more than happy to support some of that kind of research to push for this type of policies.
Thank you for the offer. I like that definitive manner in which you respond. We don't have time to make a summary of all the very interesting points that have been put forward. But just a couple of points, I'd like to highlight the things that I took away from the very fascinating discussion. One is that there are many tools, there are many approaches out there. But one of the things we want to highlight today is the human rights approach. That this is an approach that has not been used adequately as much as it should have been. And we want to emphasize this approach to those persons responsible. We want to inspire those persons responsible that the human rights approach is another approach that should be taken account when you're considering the approach to reducing the burden of NCDs. The second point I'd like to make is I was pleased to see the number of institutions involved, because only when we have collective work or cooperative work by the institutions of the Caribbean and those other institutions that the Caribbean incorporate, such as the O'Neill Law School, for example, the other institutions that the Caribbean incorporates, that we can make an effective approach to the policymakers. The last point I'd like to make, the penultimate point I'd like to make is the emphasis that Dr. St. John put on the imperative of COVID, not to forget COVID. COVID has brought a new reality, in a sense, to many places. And one of the new realities is that working together is better than working separately. And this can be played out as well in the area of NCDs and specifically in the area of the rights to health. And although we know that it is states that are responsible, we like to think that the Caribbean as a whole can take an approach. So thank you all very much. Dr. Radix?
Wow, I feel like I'm on the speed train. The time has gone by so quickly, but it's been so engaging, and there's been so much that I have learned about front of package labeling and the human rights toolbox approach. I want to take the opportunity to thank everyone who's contributed to this. Certainly the time taken by persons to give welcome remarks at the beginning, the insightful presentation by the UN Special Rapporteur, and of course, all of our panelists in this very engaging discussion around where we're going with front of package labeling in the CARICOM region. It seems that we are leading, certainly not the first, but one of the first to really move this process forward in terms of making sure persons have the right to know. We've already said the health of the region is the wealth of the region. We know we've put NCDs at the forefront with the Port of Spain Declaration. And now we're saying that high salt, high sugar, high fat, we have the right to know that. And so I would like to close by thanking all participants and reminding everyone that leaving here, you should be thinking about what is it where I sit that I need to do to enable this process moving forward so that we can have persons know what they're eating. So thank you very much.
Dr. Radix, one point.
Yes.
I just wish you to add specifically Elise and Jesse and your thank you notes.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sir George. That's very, very important. Elise and Jesse, and especially Elise, because they have been the engines behind this conversation, and I hope we'll have many more exciting conversations on this. So thank you, Sir George, and thank you to everyone who's participated. And I just wanted to say that I think we had about 30 questions coming in. They've been captured. Persons will still look at them. We will still be aware of all the concerns and comments brought up. And so I just want to thank everyone for your active participation.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.